crudely drawn image of, did it on Harvard Graphics, of how the curve laid out and how things were spaced, so that he could look at it himself. And when I was at Howard in '94, we had, actually it was '93, '94, we had a group of different scientists who were still investigating Mars, and we had an email correspondence going on. We could send our email to one address and it would be distributed to the whole group. So when I sent the email, it went to everybody in the group, which was consisted of Dr. Horace Crater, John Anthony West, Dan Drazen. It was a whole number of guys that were all part of this investigative thing. And they all saw the Morgan curve. Well, Dr. Stanley McDaniel coined it that. But Dr. Horace Crater, he renamed it, I mean, he did the math on it, and he calculated that for these things to be the way they are, it would be like 1 in a million chance that they would just randomly come up that way. But as I show this to you, you'll understand that this can't be just coincidence. All right, we all know the face. There's the face, 10 degrees sunset. NASA said if there was a second photograph of the face at a different sun angle, the face would disappear. And there was a second photograph, which Vincent DiPietro and Greg Molinard discovered 3 years later. They ran a computer algorithm on it, found a perfect circle in the eye socket, just as they had in the original photograph. And now you could see the other side of the face a little more. Found out that it was actually half humanoid, ape-like, and the other side was a lion. And I'll show you that as I get down. Here's the fort with the walls that don't look like walls when you look at it close up. But if you were going to try to pass a message on to generations, thousands of years down the road, how would you do it? You couldn't put it on paper because it would deteriorate. If you put it on some kind of optical or magnetic storage, the technology could get lost. But if you build it in stone, it would pass down through the years. And people mathematically becoming savvy again could decipher what it was and tell you what it was all about. Well, that's what Cydonia is all about. Here's the D&M pyramid down here. D&M pyramid. Just blow up. It points due north, and the face is offset to north by 19.5 degrees. 19.5 is an important number to remember. How many people saw Mission to Mars? Anybody remember him saying, take off at 1950 hours regardless? Okay. Well, that was a message to Hoagland, because they could have said, take off at 1930 hours, take off at 2000 hours. But they chose 1950. Why? 19.5. Bruce De Palma is the brother of Brian De Palma, who's the producer who did Mission to Mars for Disney. Okay? But he was rushed and he didn't get the music score right. So people said, they didn't like it because the music wasn't there to tell you how to feel at certain points. But I thought it was a good movie. Anyway, here's the city square. The city square is 4 mounds that are made or arranged in such a way that they're 90 degrees apart from each other. So if you connect them, they make a square. This is a close-up of it from the Mars Global Surveyor. And that's the layout of the circles around the images. That first one that came up, keep an eye on that. You'll see it again later. And here's the Morgan curve. When Dr. Carlotto created this orthographically correct photo, I got a copy of it back in 1988. I notified Messrs. Burke and Murphy and Arledge. Roone Arledge, everyone know him, ABC Sports. He became the head of ABC News. I told them exactly what happened, how NASA manipulated our camera crew away from Goddard, etc. I sent a copy of the videotape from the camera crew that was there, which was actually, that crew was commissioned by Hoagland to videotape the briefing. because he knew how NASA was in terms of being kind of clandestine. When they say, yeah, we'll do it, and then they turn around and said they won't. Richard had given one of the employees at NASA a copy of Dr. Carlotta's 3D animation rotation of the face to make copies of it. When he went back to retrieve the tape, they said, oh, we know nothing about the tape. And he couldn't find the guy. So he went scouring all through NASA and Goddard, and he found the tape sitting on the erase shelf waiting to be erased. Anyway, I took Dr. Carlotta's orthographically correct photo, put it in a copy machine, because I was going to send a copy of this photo with my letter to these heads of ABC. And this copy machine was really lousy, so the picture went from multiple grays to virtually black and white. I looked at the copy and I said, I can't use this. But then I noticed something that you couldn't really notice in this multiple gray photo because it doesn't stand out. But suddenly there was these little mounds that were jutting out all this light. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, why are these things suddenly jutting out all this light? The only things that are really putting out light are the DNA pyramid, the face, and the other pyramidal structures that have that slope to it that reflects that kind of light. Well, I noticed these guys here. I noticed this guy. I also noticed this guy. You connect these guys, you got a curve. I'm saying, well, wait a minute. Am I just making this up? And that red line that you see is actually, in PowerPoint, is actually part of a circle. So that shows you the geometry of how close this thing falls, okay? So I didn't like draw it freehand. That's a part of a circle. So you see how close it is. So now I started to wonder, I'm looking at the spacing of these guys, and I noticed that the distance between the first and second mound doubles between the second and third. The distance between the second and third doubled between the third and the fourth. The distance between the fourth and the fifth didn't double, and I'm going, oh, wait a minute. Well, why doesn't that double? Dan Drazen had pointed out, and if you read Hoagland's book, that if you go from the center of the city square out to the tip of the fort, that distance doubles to get from the tip of the fort out to the teardrop on the face. Then that distance from the fort to the teardrop doubles from the teardrop to get out to the cliff, which is out here. So now you have a doubling in the spacing. So I'm thinking, okay, well, I've got 4 mounds. They're spaced exponentially. I have 4 major structures: the city square, the fort, the face, and the cliff. Maybe that's all it was intended for. But then I skipped the 5th one and went to the 6th one. And the 6th one is perfectly double the distance between the 3rd and the 4th. Perfectly double the distance. So now I'm going, well, wait a minute. Why doesn't the 5th one fit this exponential pattern? Then I noticed that if you go from the 6th mound to the 4th mound, of course you have what's called a tangent across the curve. But if you keep going the same amount of distance, you come to this guy. Now you have a ray across the curve. Okay? This is basic high school geometry. We all learned this, plotting curves, x, y axis, all that stuff, right? So now, to show that these things are exponentially spaced, I said I got to come up with something to try to show it. Angles work great, right? This is 20 degrees. Actually, dead center through this mound is 19.5 degrees. What's significant about 19.5? Oh, face is offset by 19.5 degrees, right? This coincidence? This angle is 30 degrees, a difference of 10 degrees from the 20, right? This angle is 35 degrees, which is a difference of 5 degrees versus the 30-degree angle. So what we have here is you're seeing a difference of 5 degrees, 10 degrees, 20 degrees. So what should this angle be if it's getting bigger and it's exponential? We got 5, 10, 20. Anybody? 40? And that's a 40-degree angle. remember this angle here, this angle right here is what? 20 degrees. So if this is 20 degrees and that's 40 degrees, this angle has to be 120 degrees because all three angles add to 180 degrees. Right, son? Had to get him straight on his math. You know. He did pretty good this year. He did really good and almost made a B honor roll. He had a little less than a B average. Anyway, now, when I was making this animation, I didn't make it on PowerPoint. I sat down with an operator at ABC running a Silicon Graphics machine, which is a high-speed, high-computer machine to do animations. And it looks roughly like this. I told him, take that ray and swing it 45 degrees. I just want to see what happens. Anybody see what happened there? Look where it hit. Look where it goes across. Now I want you to notice something, all right? This ray is exactly the same length as that ray. You see this guy here that this is cutting through? You see this little thing coming out here? It's connecting to him. You see this little guy coming out here? He's connecting to him. Let's see, how many times have we flipped the coin here? This coincidences. 45-degree angle. So the distance from this guy, when that's in green here, and the distance from this guy in relationship to that guy, they're the same distance. You connect these two, you got an isosceles triangle. You connect these two, you got an isosceles triangle. What's going on here? How many coincidences do we need? Okay, so now, I showed the curve to Earl Torn along with the ray on that day that the National Press Club got the days wrong. And Earl went home and he decided he was going to try to figure out what curve this could be. And then Richard Hoagland calls me and says, you need to talk to Earl Torn. And I said, why? He said, because you found something really interesting and Earl needs to talk to you. So I call Earl up and Earl says that he discovered the X and Y axis that plot this curve, and that this curve turns out to be, well, I'll tell you when we get there. All right? Now, he discovered that the X and Y axes were there. I didn't think of X and Y axes, even though I knew the X and Y axes are part of plotting curves. The Y axis starts at the top of the city square, goes through the mound just below that one, goes through another mound that's on the corner of the pyramid that the curve starts out from around, which I hadn't noticed, goes through the fifth mound that I kept going, why doesn't this guy fit the exponential spacing? And right up to the center of the D&M pyramid. Now, the x-axis, where does that start? X-axis starts at the one that's at the end of the ray, goes through this guy, that guy, and out to the tip of the fort. And the curve falls right into place. And the curve is a logarithmic function of E. Everybody says, okay, what's E? E is 2.72 something, some reciprocating. It's just like pi, but it's one of those constants. And in the D&M pyramid, pi shows up again and again and again mathematically. It also shows up throughout this whole complex based on the angles of how these things are arranged with each other mathematically. And Earl said, let me try the logarithmic function because E shows up again and again throughout the complex. He said, I took my graph, I laid it down over the area, and everything fell into place. He couldn't have made that up because I found the majority of the mounds. He couldn't have come along and said, let me make this and this fit. I went behind after finding out with the ruler and thinking of X and Y, and I'm going, oh my. So this is Earl and my discovery, as far as I'm concerned. Now, when I show you the latest pictures from Cydonia of the pyramid that the curve starts out from around, you're going to see why this can't be natural formations. I asked Hoagland, I said, well, what do you think these things are? And he said, obviously they're tetrahedral pyramids, because pyramids are in such a way that regardless of how the light hits them, regardless whether the sun's rising or setting or whatever, it reflects the light back up the apex. And if you ever took an old bicycle reflector and you looked at it with a magnifying glass, you'd see a whole bunch of little pyramids in it, because you've got that angle on it. Pyramids are really strange though. At exactly noon, it's lit on all sides, off all sides. 1 minute after, it's dark on one side. This guy is one of the mounds that is this is the mound that's at the end of the ray that starts the x-axis. He's oval. The strange thing is he's got a slope on him, and what you're looking at here is a 10-degree sunrise, and the other stuff was a 10-degree sunset. So we're seeing an even lighting, still with the slope, on both sides. Whether this was a tetrahedron, I don't think so. But it's an oval-type pyramid structure. We never thought of looking at pyramids as being an oval shape. But I think that's what that is. We don't even know where the word pyramid came from. It just popped up. Seriously, we don't. Now this is the bigger pyramid that's behind the one that the curve starts out from around. It's got something really interesting on the top of it, which is this little guy, and he's got a set of walls on him, or at least he looks like he's got a set of walls. But I'll dismiss him. I'll throw him out. Now, this is the start of the Morgan curve. I got a better shot, so don't fret. This is the Viking image blown up. This is the Mars Global Surveyor image. And it gets much better. If you look very carefully, you can see the three mounds that start to curve here. And there's the three here. And then this here is actually the mound that the y-axis cuts through. And here's the better shot. This is the city square. These are the three mounds that start out the curve. And I want you to notice something. This mound is almost perfectly round. But look at this connection that comes down here. This is not a gully. Dirt didn't run down off of this main structure and create a pile of dirt at the bottom, because that's a hump. That's some kind of, I guess it's a rise of some type. It could even be a tunnel, as far as I know, going from the main structure into the smaller structure. Look at this guy. He's got more of an oval shape to him. But he is also connected to this big guy. And then this guy, look how oval he is. But he also has these lines that come up to the center, almost as though he's a four-sided guy, but he doesn't have that sharp corners to him to make a pyramid. He's oval. But he was connected, but something hit right here and created this impact crater, severing him from this guy. But this is over here is also that mound that the y-axis cuts through. So this is the first mound that starts the y-axis. You cut through this mound here. You cut through this guy over here, which is missing a little bit. And then you continue out through that fifth mound and out to the D&M pyramid. And this guy also has this rounded shape to him, but how are these things just rising up out of the desert again, out of a flat plain? That's just as bad as China. How did those pyramids rise up out of the ground? They didn't get there by themselves. Here's the city square. And the three mounds that make up the Morgan curve. And you can see the exponential spacing starting. This is the lousy image that wasn't orthographically corrected. It wasn't cleaned up because you can see all the little dots and salt and pepper noise in it. Here's the fort. You can see the walls. Of course, we know now Close up, it doesn't look like that, but it was intended to look like that from day one. And then if anybody says, oh, those are made up, those dots don't exist, those mounds don't exist, here's the first one, the second one, the third one, the fourth one is out here somewhere, but it starts to get obscured in here. But all of the mounds are there. And this was labeled under head, and that's where NASA had it stored. This is Dr. Carlotta's 3D shape from shading of Cydonia. This is the fort over here. And if you look at that, you can almost see exactly what the closer pictures look like. This is a city square. And these are the three mounds that start out the Morgan curve. Now, here's the city square again. And I want you to look at this mound here. Does this look familiar? Let me get to it again. Now does it look familiar? Strange thing is that the angles on the fort's walls are the same angles that are on the city square mound wall. If you overlaid those guys, they would virtually match. Now the back side of this thing also has this funny little trident shape, which we know looks washed out and pretty much weathered over time. But down here, there's another little shape that looks much like the back side of the fort. And if you squint, like the Lincoln thing, you can see that the one that's blown up here looks pretty much like this. But he's pointed this way, the other one's pointed that way. And here's some blow-ups of it. And if this is designed anything like this is, if we could really get some sharp, close details of this, if they're designed the same way, it's not a natural coincidence by any stretch of the imagination. And I don't think it is, because you would not get two triangular objects like this in the same general location, let alone exponential spacing in the same general location. And this is the area closer to those little guys that we were looking at. And this guy here has an unusual characteristic about him. Now, going back to Japan again, we're going back to Japan this time, instead of China. This is underwater off the coast of Japan. People are arguing, this came off of Laura Lee's site again, they're arguing whether this is a natural formation or not. If you look at this guy, you'll see all of these nice parallel lines, and you'll even see this trapezoidal pattern here. This is another angle of it. Now if you look, you can see that it's going off down into the water. Now they're arguing about this. This is right here under our noses, and they're arguing about whether it's natural or artificial. This is a trench that's made into it. I don't know how that became a natural formation. And this just blows everybody's mind. This is a natural formation that's got corners to it. It's a block sticking out of coral. But it's a natural formation, right? I don't know how it did that. These are some holes. They're pretty perfect because those are perfect circles. They're pretty darn close. Yeah, this is natural, isn't it? This is at the top of it. This looks like some kind of sacrificial altar or some kind of throne to sit in or something. That just does not make sense. How can you argue about that? If they're going to argue about this, it's right here under our noses, how are they going to even see anything sitting on the surface of another planet? And they're going to argue about it. This is interesting. This is a little model that was found in an ancient temple. I don't speak German, but if anybody does, you can read that. But this is where these images came from, as a website. They say, oh, this is a bird. I don't think so either. And these were little models that were found in ancient temples around the world in different locations. They said, oh, these are representations of insects or birds. I have never seen a bird with a tail fin and rudder. Never in my life have I seen a bird look like that. This looks more like a jet engine underneath here, a wheel, pilot sitting up here. It just doesn't fit. It just does not make sense. So some guys said, hey, let's duplicate some of these and see if they fly. Guess what, guys? They fly. These guys made a different model. And it flies. Of course, they had a jet engine in theirs. Somebody said to me, oh, you can make anything fly. Just because Dumbo had the ears and he flew, that don't mean you can make anything fly. I used to fly gas airplanes. I used to make my own designs. No, you cannot get anything to fly. No. Not in aerodynamically. Maybe electromagnetically, somehow defying gravity, yeah. But you can't get anything to fly, especially like the F-117, the stealth fighter. They can't get that to fly. The only reason it's flying is because they've got computers, 5 computers, all making compensations to make it stay stable. If they didn't have the computers, no, you could not get it to fly. It would not fly. Trust me. It's only because the computers are making so many adjustments to ailerons and things that a pilot could never do. It flies. This has no computer in it. All it has is a remote control so they can remotely control the ailerons and everything. Hoagland showed this on Opening of the Tombs Live, was on Fox. Every time I show this, people go, hey, what is this? Well, they don't say that. They know what it is. But what, you guys know what this is? We all agree, right? It's a helicopter. You haven't got to be a genius to see that. You don't have to be that. You know what this is? Well, look at it again. Tank. And if you look very carefully, you see these parallel lines here. And there's a few over here. Are those treads? Are those treads? Now, if you want to see a submarine, maybe that's what this is, but I don't know what the heck this is. But it looks like a plane because it's got a tail fin on it, okay? Yeah. You know what the story behind this thing is? This is the ancient war machines. This is the ancient war machines. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Helicopter, tank, plane. This is ancient. And this is not something somebody made up. This is sitting over in Egypt, sitting in the area. All right? There's the tank. Okay? There's your helicopter. Okay? And if anybody tries to tell you that the helicopter is supposed to be a sarcophagus with the spirit rising out of it, all right? They think a lot of the symbols that they used came out of this or were incorporated in it. This is the actual relief that was shown on Opening of the Tombs Live. But this had been altered, and Richard didn't notice that, but the tank was altered. He thought it looked like something else. And if you notice, the bird is missing here. There was supposed to be the bird right here. The bird's missing. Now the bird's back. This is videotape, okay? So you can't manipulate that. If it's a still that's that you can get into a computer, yeah, you can manipulate it. But this is videotape and taken from the videotape, and you can clearly see the tank's turret, the plane, all of this stuff is there, the bird's there. All right? This is another Egyptian tomb where actually this hieroglyph is at. And I didn't put that picture in here because it's actually sitting up above. This is that guy that I was telling you about that looked kind of strange. I got my slides out slightly out of order, but If you look at him, you'll see all these little parallel lines look like a comb coming out down at the bottom. And then there's this weird little shape here. Well, the website that I got this off of, this guy thought that this kind of looked familiar. He thinks it kind of looks like that. And I'm almost inclined to agree with him. It kind of does look like it. But there's a whole story about the Dogon tribe. Everybody know about the Dogon tribe in Africa? And they had the Sirens came down and they had features of dolphins. They lived in water. Sometimes I think the dolphins are smarter than we think, and they're just sitting back, look at those fools. Maybe they're descendants of the Sirens. Who knows? And you notice that there's this line drawing in the ground. And this is the image of the face that was shot with the craft tilted off axis, looking back at it. The reason you see all of these vertical lines in there, these thin vertical lines, those are actually the CCD array elements. And when you get to a certain level, they start to show up. And every CCD has its own specific fingerprint because the elements in it have different light reception capabilities, or they have certain level outputs, because you can't make them all uniform, or not at this point in time anyway. So each one has its own set of fingerprints, and they raise the pedestal level on this thing, or raise the black level so high that you start to see the fingerprints of the CCD. And they said, see, we tell you there's nothing there, but the face is here. This is an orthographically correct contrast enhanced image. This does not have the full spectrum of gray in it. There is no blacks in here. When you have a picture, there should be blacks, there should be whites, and then there should be grays in between. This is all gray. There is no blacks. That means that the histogram of this is all wrong, and it's because they raised the pedestal. But if you look very carefully at this guy here is the teardrop. Right here, the shadowed area is actually the perfect circle in the eye socket representing the pupil. Up here, you'll see these lines. These patterns, the V-shaped over here, and this guy over here, are in the original Viking image. So they're still there. If you look along these edges, this edge and this edge down at the bottom, they are parallel to each other, and they go straight down and they curve around and go back over to the other side of the face and come back up. Okay? This is a contrast stretch from the Viking image of the face. When you take the left side and mirror it over, you get this kind of an image. When you take the right half and you image it over, mirror it over, you get this. And this is more or less the face of a lion. And one day I'm going to trace this out so if I can put an overlay over it. When Hoagland showed this at the UN in 1992, everybody gasped because what they saw immediately was this image of this lion, and it stood out. And this is the left half, the lion side of the picture that they just took they dismissed the face with. And even though it was lit up the way it is, it's still got some characteristics in there. And this is what's called fractal analysis. Dr. Mark Carlotto did it. What fractal analysis is that fractals is nature's mathematics, discovered by a guy named Mandelbrot. And he discovered it while working at IBM. They laughed at him, said he didn't have anything. But in essence, he had actually discovered the nature's mathematics. It's part of the chaos theory. And they discovered that by using this in computers, they could actually separate man-made objects from natural objects. That's how we found Scud missiles, etc., in the desert. Because the spy satellites would take the image, they do a fractal analysis of the surrounding area, and then you look for objects that just did not fit that fractal fit. Because with fractals, you could take a rock, and the way that the surface of that rock is pitted and the way it looks can then be expanded to represent the whole area. Or that area can be taken in, and then you can see a representation of how that rock should look. So in essence, an area becomes what it is because of what affects it, and it goes all the way down to the smallest rocks. Well, when you run this fractal analysis, all these dark areas mean that those are fractal fits. Anything that's bright means that it just doesn't fit the fractal fit of this area. So you've got some structures here that just do not fit, and this is the face, and he definitely doesn't fit. This is another shot of the D&M pyramid. It's a raw image. The D&M pyramid sits at a latitude of 40.87, I believe, which cuts dead through the center. And where the latitude cuts through the center is at 19, it creates a 19.5 degree angle. Where it cuts the other latitude, which is, I forgot, it's the tangent or arctangent of the main latitude, it cuts through, it creates an angle of 19.5 degrees. This is the overall area of Cydonia. Remember I told you that there was an exponential spacing from the city square, it's right here, out to the fort, from the fort out to the face, and then from the face out to the cliff. And this is the cliff. The cliff is another interesting thing. Here we have this guy that has straight lines on him sitting perpendicular to the splash pattern of the crater. If you look at the texture of the ground, you can see where the molten earth spilt out and created this splash pattern around the crater. But this thing is sitting perpendicular to it. It's 1,500 feet high. The splash should have either covered it up or backed up behind it, and it did neither. So that meant that this was made after the crater was made. The Tholus is another object which is down here, and he looks like Silbury Hill, which is a round earthen mound. And moving on, here's the cliff, and you can see the straight lines on them. The crater has some kind of pyramidal object here, which is another thing that we need to look at very carefully. And this guy here, he's very interesting. But when I saw Dr. Mark Larlato's 3D from shading of this guy, I got a distinct impression that what we were looking at was a human torso, the head turned on its side, and the arms stretched through some kind of slab that is laying on. Almost like somebody laying on a surfboard or something. And you have the back, the spine, the buttocks, the thighs, and the calves. And then this guy looks like this guy was stretched out and bent around the crater. Now, Hoagland and Torn found a relationship between the angles between all of these guys. And those angles are the angles that are incorporated in the D&M pyramid. Again, we've got coincidences that just stretch beyond the imagination. These are the constants that Earl discovered in the D&M pyramid. The A angle is 60 degrees. 15 minutes. Okay. Are equal to pi divided by 3. The B angle is 120 degrees, which is that front angle of the D&M pyramid, which is 2 pi divided by 3 in radians. And so you got degrees, you've got radians, you've got the ratios, angle ratios, you've got the trig functions. And remember, all of this stuff worked out to 3 decimal places on the accuracy. This is another dynamics theory that Hoagland and Torn came up with, which is on Hoagland's site, and he can explain it better than I can. But if you look at that carefully, you can see the circumscribed tetrahedral geometry in here, which I'm going to get to if I can. It's just too much of a coincidence, again, that these things are arrayed the way they are. Now, this is a circumscribed tetrahedral geometry. What that means is if you take a tetrahedron, which is a three-sided, actually four sides if you count the bottom, that's what tetra is for, four. But it's a three-sided if you just look at the top. You put it in a sphere so that the tip touches the North Pole or the South Pole. Where it touches the sphere again is at a latitude of, what do you think? 19.5. The corners are spaced 120 degrees apart from each other around the sphere. On Olympus Mons, at 19.5 approximately, is Olympus Mons, the largest shielded volcano on Mars. Mars even puckers at that spot. On Jupiter is Jupiter's great red spot. They kept saying, this is a hurricane that's been going on for thousands and thousands of years. No, it's not. When they got out to Jupiter, they said, well, we're going to have to rewrite the book on Jupiter because it's not doing what we thought it was doing. They can't explain why that spot is there. Jupiter's putting out more energy than it's getting from the sun. Neptune's great dark spot was sitting at a latitude of 19.5. And I say was because it's no longer there. But NASA kept saying, oh, when we get out to Neptune, we're going to find this big frozen ball of gas because it's so far away from the sun, the gas is frozen solid. Well, were they in for a surprise? Neptune had the fastest winds in the solar system, and it was putting out 2.7 times more energy than is coming from the sun. Where is the energy coming from? They don't know. They can't explain it. And it's not fusion, because they're going to find that the sun is not a fusion reactor, okay? And you're hearing me tell you this. The sun is not a fusion reactor. It has fusion byproducts as the actual workings of the sun, but it's not a fusion reactor, okay? And the reason that Neptune, Jupiter, Saturn are all putting out more energy than they're getting from the sun is because they're doing the same thing the sun's doing. It's just that they don't have enough mass to shunt that kind of energy across from the fourth dimension. And this is a double inscribed tetrahedron, circumscribed tetrahedron. This is looking down on the North Pole. And if you look at that, you see an ancient symbol, which has been a... Yeah, it looks like the Star of David. Does that star have more significance than we ever thought? The Germans were looking into all kinds of things that were discovered back in the past that the Sumerians knew and the Mayans, and they started working on technology that people were laughing at. And when NBC did the show with about Philip Corso, and Corso said, well, later I could tell you about the time machine the Germans were working on. He laughed at him, tried to make him look like he was nuts. Yes, the Germans were working on a time machine because they knew there was more to this than what we know right now. That's why they were able to invent the jet. That little model I showed you looked like the first German jet because they came across this stuff and they weren't skeptical. They said, hey, there's something here, and they weren't stupid. And that's why they got a jump in terms of technology and could have beat the crap out of us. We got lucky. The Japanese were working on an atomic bomb. We got lucky. And we say, oh, we're so good, we're so righteous, everything. No, we got lucky. We got lucky. Maybe that symbol that's been adopted as the Star of David is trying to tell us about circumscribed tetrahedral geometry. If you connect the 6 points of this guy, you get a hexagonal pattern. Around the pole of Saturn, let's see, how can we prove that this circumscribed tetrahedral geometry is actually doing anything? It's not, there's no pyramids inside the planets. This geometry is representing planetary energy flow. The energy comes in at the pole and upwells at a latitude of, there you go, okay? Well, Saturn doesn't have a spot on it. Neptune doesn't have a spot on it now either, for the same reason that I'm about to tell you about Saturn. But around the pole of Saturn is a perfect hexagonal cloud pattern. When Voyager went over the pole of Saturn, the only planet whose pole it did go over, but it did go over the pole of one of the moons, which has a hexagonal snow pattern. Snow fell in a hexagonal pattern, okay. It took enough pictures to make an animation of the clouds moving around the pole of Saturn. Now, let me back up because I went too fast. If you look here, you can see the outline of the hexagonal pattern. The clouds are going at over 300 miles an hour. They go to the corners of the hexagonal and they turn. There's nothing in our physics that can explain that. I don't care how good you are, you cannot explain that. But if the energy is inwelling at that point, mathematicians have calculated that there's at least 25 other dimensions out there. A key signature of one dimension folding into another one would yield a hexagonal pattern. Well, if the fourth dimension is folding into our three-dimensional world, boom, we get a hexagonal pattern. And there it is. If we had a camera on Ulysses, which is the probe that's going over and under the poles of the sun, I bet you anything, they would see some kind of hexagonal pattern. That would clinch this whole thing about the theory of the circumscribed tetrahedral geometry. Saturn had a spot on it, or started to get a spot, in 1991. A storm started to rage. Saturn never had a spot on it, but it has a perfect band of clouds going around at 19.5. NASA scratched their heads in their butts and they couldn't figure out why this storm was raging. I asked Hoagland, I said, so why is there a storm on Saturn? He said, because most likely all the moons have lined up on one side and they're influenced the energy flow to collect into a vortex. Saturn's moons are so far away, they can't influence the energy. So I go to a program I have called Dance of the Planets, and I put in the date that this started, and I look at Saturn. And all the moons, except for one, were on one side of Saturn. So what does that mean? Now you've got an increase in gravitational influence, and a storm starts to rage, and a spot starts to form. As soon as the moons misalign, the spot goes away. Saturn's moons are so close that they're constantly influencing it, so the spot stays there. All right? So there seems to be a pattern here. And where's that latitude that this storm is? 19.5. Now this is an infrared of Saturn, and you can see this little hot spot in the middle here. And it's sitting approximately at the 19.5 latitude. This is the sun. On the sun, sitting at approximately 19.5, there's a concentration of heat in sunspots. And if you look here, you can definitely see the hot spots. When the Skylab astronauts took photos, infrared photos of the sun, they found these hot spots or coronas sitting at approximately 19.5. They were spaced 120 degrees apart from each other around the sun. Are those the tips of the imaginary tetrahedron? This is a solar flare. This is a result of fusion. All right? There are fusion reactions that take place on the sun, but it's not a fusion reactor. With the sun having so much mass and rotating mass reaches into the fourth dimensional space. We have the height, width, and depth. But as you spin this guy, he swings through other dimensions that we can't perceive. And as he goes through those dimensions, if you've got enough mass, the energy inwells and comes out at 19.5. Here's the sun, and here's Saturn, and I'm gambling on it that there's a hexagonal pattern around the pole of the sun. Now the terrestrial connection. Where's the spot here on the Earth? This is Jupiter, infrared wavelength 5 microns, and you can clearly see the spot. But you also see at the other latitude, 19.5, this really hot spot. Okay, here on the Earth. What is this guy called here? El Nino. Why? He's sitting at what? Approximately 19.5. Why is he there? Because that's where the energy likes to come up. What's sitting at 19.5? World's largest volcano. Uninterrupted volcano. It's coming up out of the middle of the plates. Usually volcanoes come up out of the cracks between the plates. This is coming up out of the middle of the ocean. I'm supposed to ask some questions. If anybody would like to ask questions, go ahead and I can continue and fill in the last things. Okay? This is Dr. Bruce De Palma's Zen machine. Michael Faraday actually discovered that we could get electricity straight from a magnet using induction, not using induction, but using, well, he didn't give it an effect, but it's called the N effect by Dr. De Palma. Michael Faraday discovered induction, which is you take a magnet, move it through a wire through the magnetic field, you get the current to flow. With this principle, you take a disc magnet, you put a disc conductor on it, you spin it all as one unit, and you'll get a current to flow from the edge of the disc, or from the center of the disc to the edge of the disc. So those are your plus and minus poles. But in this scenario, what you get is an inverse of induction. Instead of a high voltage and a low current, as with induction, with this effect, you get a high current and a low voltage. So Dr. Palmer took high Gauss magnets, arrayed them in a drum, balanced it on a shaft, spun it at like 7,000, 8,000 RPM. This is his device. At a tenth of a volt, he said he had 8,000 amps coming out of it. At 2.7 volts, he said he had 15,000 plus amps coming out of this thing. He said if you could draw it, it would put it out. Now, you can short this thing, it doesn't slow down. You can load it down, it doesn't slow down. You can short it, it doesn't burn out. You can short it, tap off other contact points on it, still get your current to flow. This is violating the laws of what they call electricity. No, it's not. No, it's not. It's just doing what it's supposed to do. We just never accepted what it's doing. The amazing thing about this is this device, based on Ohm's law and all the other principles, is putting out 5 times more energy than it's getting to drive the motor, to turn the whole shebang. Again, that's supposed to be defying the laws of energy conservation. No, it's not defying the laws of energy conservation. We do it all the time. An atomic bomb, we use a small amount of energy to tap into a larger source. That's all we're doing. This is doing the same thing. The magnets are rotating. The mass is rotating. It's reaching into that fourth dimensional state space. And all it's doing is bringing that current that's actually generating that magnetic flux around the magnet to the surface into a conductor so that we can get a hold of it. And it's a tremendous current. This is another principle. And this is on Hoagland's site too. And it's showing a potential between these 2 points around this disk. Why is there a potential there? This is James Patterson and his son. Nightline did a show about James Patterson. Patterson has a lot of patents under his belt. This guy is well known in terms of creating things. Everybody remember Pons and Fleischmann, fusion in a bottle? No? It was a big stir some years ago. They said they were getting more energy out than what was going in. And they were using nickel and palladium in a bottle with sending electricity in. And they were getting more heat out than what was going in. MIT tried to duplicate the experiment. They said, we didn't get any results. Gene Mailoff left MIT because they lied. He founded Cold Fusion magazine because he knew they got results. Well, Mr. Patterson here, one of his patents is for making perfect spheres from microscopic to ball bearing size. He coated his spheres in nickel and palladium, sandwiched them between 2 electrodes, sent water through, sent in a high current electricity to get this thing jump started, and then dropped it down to trickle of milliamps. And this thing continuously put 1,200 to 1,400 watts of energy into the water, heating the water as the water goes through, with only a milliamps of current going through it. That's unheard of. You can't do that. You've got to have amps going into this thing to make it put out that kind of energy. But he had just milliamps going in. So our science correspondent, Michael Gilliam, he was skeptical. So he went to see Mr. Patterson. And he did a story on it. And he came back, well, you know, maybe it's this, that, and the other. He's still skeptical. So people wrote in and said, when are you going to do a follow-up on Dr. Patterson? He went back, and Patterson now had his own, laboratory. And he says, we have a hot water heater manufacturer and a fellow from the nuclear waste disposal, federal nuclear waste disposal, who are both looking at this device. So you say, well, why is a guy from the federal nuclear waste disposal looking at this device? Well, he had some radioactive material. He poured it into the water that was circulating through this, what he calls the Patterson power cell. And in time lapse, over 2 hours, the Geiger counter went from being almost pegged down to almost being nothing. This thing was neutralizing radioactive material. Theoretically, that's not supposed to happen. But yet he was doing it. So whatever is going on in this device is defying what we have set forth in terms of the laws of physics. And this was actually on Good Morning America as well. So Nightline did it, Good Morning America did it, and this is showing the radioactivity actually going down. This is Silbury Hill in England. This is Avery. Somebody, I forgot, last name is Percy. He discovered that Avery and Silbury Hill, because here's Avery up here, Silbury Hill back here, kind of look like the crater in the Tholus on Mars. And here's the crater. Here's the cliff. Here's the cliff, the crater, and here's the Tholus. And if you go straight down the cliff to the center of the Tholus and then back out through that pyramidal structure on the crater, you get an angle of 19.5. This is an overlay of Avery and Silbury Hill. And the diameters of these things virtually match, 1 for 1. Did somebody try to duplicate what was on Mars over in England by creating Avery and Silbury Hill? Sidonia's latitude is 40.9. This is the Sphinx. His latitude is 30 degrees. If I back up for a second, which is E prime divided by pi, 0.866. E prime divided by pi, which equals 8.66. So we have a correlation between Egypt, Giza, and Sidonia Mars. The Sphinx, they think, is older than what it is because there's water erosion on it, on the back of it. There's water erosion all along the back of the pit that it's in. And the only way you can have water erosion is you have to have water, and it doesn't rain in the desert. Not that kind of way. And it hasn't for thousands of years. So they're thinking this is at least, this is, what do they say, 10,000 years, 50,000 years old? It goes way back because you have to get a lot of water going to get this kind of erosion. The angle on the pyramid is 52 degrees. 52 divided by 60 is 0.865, or E divided by pi. Errol Torn discovered that this golden spiral here, which goes out into the desert to nowhere, the ratio of it, A to B, is E divided by pi, or 0.865 again. And then this is a crop circle. And this crop circle showed up just about the time that Hoagland and Torn had discovered the circumscribed tetrahedral geometry. Now I saw a show on the Learning Channel, and secrets revealed. And they said, yeah, these guys got out there and they were able to make all these patterns and this, that, and the other, and ja. And some people say, yeah, well, it means something just because they think it means something. But people got out here and made this thing. Well, ancient alchemists used to incorporate in pictograms their knowledge of a certain subject. And unless you were another ancient alchemist, you couldn't figure out what they were saying. Well, this is telling us about the circumscribed tetrahedral geometry. And if you look at this guy, you can clearly see this is a two-dimensional representation of a tetrahedron, which goes to the center of this circle, which then is ringed. Okay? If you look at this spiral, which is sitting at the top of the tetrahedron, which could be, I guess, the pole of the planet, you've got a 6-arm spiral. If you connect the tips of the spiral, you get what pattern? A hexagonal. If that's the energy inwelling at the pole and coming out at a latitude of 19.5, and this may be representing a moon, then you would get a vortex spiral, and this is a 6-step Fibonacci spiral, which would represent the spot forming. How could some goofball put together something this complex, go out in the field, put it out there, and go, oh yeah, I just came up with that design out of the top of my head? This means something. And it goes even further. If you take the angles within this, the angles are 19.5 in the center of this guy, 22.5 on the edge of him, 45 degrees on the edge of that guy, 49.6 in the center of him, 52 degrees on the edge of that guy, and 69.4 to the edge of the main circle. They said on the show, well, this is all good and well because these things are spaced in such a way with the tram lines, et cetera, et cetera. If you tried to make this based on the tram lines, the math wouldn't come out to the angles that are in the D&M pyramid. Not by a long shot. Also embedded in there is a hyperdimensional design. Well, actually, the design fits within this pattern of the design. And that could probably have been made by pranksters. This is a fractal pattern which is created by the Mandelbrot set, which you usually use a computer to do. That's the Mandelbrot fractal set. Kind of looks like a beetle or bug. And this is a field that crop circles first showed up in. But the design of this, it first started out with one pattern, the big circle and 4 orbiting circles, like one day, and then a few days later the next pattern showed up. And this is a stamp set from Grenada, and I think I'm almost at the end of my slides. But the thing about the crop circles that they didn't talk about on that show is that the plant becomes magnetic. If you put a magnet near it, it's attracted to the magnet. We can't make plants magnetic. But whatever's altering the plants and making them do that has something to do with this energy that's changing the plants. And sometimes this is a sore subject, but if you go back to Edward Meyer, and how many people know about Edward Billy Meyer? Okay, he's a Swedish farmer who took those fantastic photographs of these Palladian spacecraft and the 8mm film footage and a whole bunch of other stuff. And the first thing they did was try to dismiss him and shoot him down. And before crop circles started showing up, he was showing plants that were laying down and swirled where these craft had set down, and the energy under the pads where they sat down caused the plants to bend over and swirl. And he said that the plants would eventually stand back up and grow straight after a long period of time when the energy had dissipated. Well, in these crop circles, the true crop circles, the plants continue to grow until they mature. Whereas when someone comes along and stomps them down, they break, they die, and that's the end of it. They didn't talk about that in the Secrets Revealed. All right, so but anyway, there's some events taking place now that I think that we're going to eventually get the full story, because I think their backs are against the wall, any more craft flying over Phoenix or anywhere else, I think they're going to have a hard time explaining it, because video cameras are very prevalent. People are catching planes crashing in the ocean, or you know, you look at real TV, you see all kinds of weird stuff going on. People just happen to have their video camera and they're catching it. The video that came out of Mexico, the big saucer craft going behind the apartment buildings. Oh, it's a hoax, it's a hoax, it's a hoax. It's too good, it's too good. When is it going to be not too good? I mean, when is it going to be good, but it's going to be real, right? You're going to shoot down everybody's credibility. You listen to Jack Schulman. He's telling you about his experiences. He's telling you the truth. I'm telling you the truth about all the things I've experienced with NASA, and watch how they did the stuff. Yeah, we get out on the highway, we have enough trust in our majority going to do the right thing. The others are going to act like idiots. But when we have people coming out of the woodwork telling us, hey, this has happened to me, we saw this, we saw that, they're trying to tell us the truth. Some are embarrassed to even tell us the truth because society has put that stigma on them. But now that's starting to go away. If anybody listened to the Art Bell show July 6th, when and I've been talking to Steve, I've known him for a while. They had a guy on who was working in the Carter administration, and he said Carter had sent him to do the investigation of the UFOs, because remember, Carter said that when he got into the White House, he was going to open everything about the UFOs, because Carter saw one himself, and they tried to dismiss it as being, oh, you saw the tricks of light and shadow, or not tricks of light, you saw the planet Venus, which is a trick of light. Well, this guy said that he went researching. He thought he wouldn't get refused anything, but he got refused time and time again. And then he went to the CIA to get documents, and he was refused. You know who the director was at the CIA at that time? George Bush. George Bush, Mr. Oil, who eventually became president. Then he said, I'm not going to meet with Mr. Gorbachev without an agenda. And he kept saying that. Then the landing in Voronezh, how many people remember that? The Russian landing where they said, the kids said they saw these 9-foot-tall aliens get out with a little robot, and a whole bunch of stuff was going on. Police officers saw it, people in hotels saw it, etc. And then they said they got back in the craft and they took off. Kids drew pictures. One kid drew a picture that I looked at it and I said, I've seen that symbol someplace before. And I went and found one of my books where these two brothers had taken this photograph of this pie pan craft that had turned up on its side, and underneath of it was that same exact symbol back in 1968. I'm like, this more than coincidence. Keep flipping that coin, it keeps coming up heads. When are we going to say, let me see the coin? It's got to be a two-headed coin. It's a symbol that represents Saturn. It's sort of like the International Harvester symbol with the H with the little I in the middle, but it's the H and there's a little split in the middle, but the H has two curves on the outside of it. Yeah, like that with the symbol in the middle. Anyway, Bush kept saying he wasn't going to meet with Mr. Gorbachev without an agenda. The next thing we know, this story comes out about the landing in Voronezh and all the people that saw it, et cetera, and this, that, and the other. And the media jumped on it for a change. But they said, oh, the TASS has become more tabloidish now that they've got the dog collar off, and they're talking about. No, the Kremlin could have squashed that at any time they wanted to. They let it out because they knew, Bush knew, that we're not alone. And Mr. Bush turned around and said, yeah, I'm going to meet with Mr. Gorbachev over in Malta. It's this summit. They met out in the little harbor. Storm they knew was coming 5 days in advance, dashing around in a little boat, just barely could get over to the ship. Out in the ship in tight security, secret. Why? because Mr. Gorbachev twisted Mr. Bush's arm by letting that story out, and all the media hit it, and it became a big story. And he says, oh, we got to do something about this. And he had to sit down and talk to the man about it because Bush knows what's going on. And he'll tell you, oh, I don't know anything. Yes, he does. They know. The guy that was talking on the Carter administration said he eventually got taken to an area in the Library of Congress where the top secret Project Blue Book files are. And he got to see the Blue Book files, the top secret ones. And he saw a craft that was stuck in the snow with the edge of the saucer sticking out, and guys in snow parkers with measuring tapes measuring this thing. And he got to see that. He got to read it. He took his report, and I forgot her name, but she eventually became, under the Bush administration, in charge of science, space and science technology or something like that. And I can't think of her name. But you have to listen to that show, because what he's telling is the truth. He's telling his experiences. A lot of us would like to think that we have our own reality. We don't have our own reality. We all exist and work in the same reality. We just get to experience different aspects of it. Because we don't get to experience a certain aspect of it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.